The wood was warm against my cheek, not from a fire. The stove had gone cold an hour earlier, and the mountain air had already started slipping through the chinks in the walls. Sharp and wet and carrying that leaf-rot smell the forest kept after sundown. But the floorboards under me held a different warmth. It came up from below, slow and animal, as if the cabin had a body under it and I was pressed to its ribs. I had one ear flat to the plank, one hand spread wide to steady myself, and I could feel the pulse more clearly than I could hear it. It lived in my teeth, a soft rolling thrum. Then a pause, then another, not mechanical, no regular whine, no rattle, no dying generator somewhere down the ridge. It felt organic, and that was the word that bothered me. And because wood shouldn't feel organic when it's been dead long enough to frame a house. The smell rose next. Damp stone, cold cave air, mineral and old water threading up through the seams in the floor. Outside, something brushed the siding. I looked through the window over the sink and saw the trees beyond the yard all moving in the same direction. There wasn't any wind. Every trunk along the slope had tipped, not bent, tipped, as if the whole stand was listening to one point in the ground. The branches made no sound, no leaves rattled, they just leaned. Then the pulse beneath me stopped. The silence hit so hard my ears clenched. A single knock came from directly under my chest. Not at the door, not at the wall. Under me. I didn't move, I didn't breathe. And all I could think was, and why had Hollis Beauregard Klein locked his rules away instead of telling me what lived under his floor? That was 6 nights after I took possession of the cabin. I came into McDowell County because a man I'd barely known had died and left me land nobody else wanted. That's the simplest version. The longer one is that Hollis Beauregard Klein had been my mother's cousin, or maybe her second cousin, one of those family branches people talked about only when somebody died or got arrested or vanished into a place so rural they might as well have been lost at sea. When the letter reached me, the paper smelled faintly of mildew and old filing cabinets, and all it said was that the property and cabin had passed to me by name, clean and legal, provided I took possession in person. But I remember thinking it was odd that Hollis Klein had known my full name. Amon Dillard Pike. Not Amon Pike. Not to surviving family. The whole thing typed neat and centered, as if he'd been preparing to hand it over to someone specific for a long time. The drive-in took most of a day, and the last part didn't feel like a road so much as a compromise with the mountain. Gravel gave way to mud. Mud narrowed into ruts, and the trees closed so tightly over the path that the light changed color under them. Everything got greener, then grayer, then dimmer. By the time I reached the final rise, I could taste iron in the air the way I always could before rain, except the sky above the canopy was clear. The cabin sat in a cut of land just below a higher slope, aimed tucked into the mountain as if somebody had tried to hide it and then changed their mind halfway through. It wasn't picturesque. It wasn't the kind of place anybody built to admire a view. The porch faced a stand of hemlock and poplar so thick the trees looked woven together. The windows were narrow. The walls were heavy. Even before I unlocked the front door, the structure gave off the sense of being braced against something that hadn't happened yet. Inside, it was cleaner than it had any right to be. No cobweb curtains, no sagging furniture drowned in sheets, no smell of old animals. Somebody had either kept it up until the end or known exactly what kind of order mattered in a place like that. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. The second was that the quiet wasn't actually quiet. Once I set my bags down and stopped moving, there was a faint tremor in the boards under my boots, subtle enough that I told myself it had to be the after effect of the drive. The place had one main room, a small kitchen, a table bolted to the floor, a narrow bedroom, and a cellar door in the corner with a fresh iron latch. Fresh enough to stand out. I crouched and touched it. Cold metal. New screws. The wood around it was older, darker, worn smooth by years of use. That detail seemed minor then. I've thought about it almost every day since. Hollis Klein hadn't lived like a recluse in the theatrical way people imagine. There were canned goods in the shelves stacked by date, dry wood cut and covered, lamps cleaned, a coil of rope near the back door, looped with the kind of care that comes from habit, not display. On the mantel there were no family pictures, no keepsakes, nothing sentimental at all. Just a brass compass, a ceramic bowl filled with loose nails, and a key on a ring that didn't fit any lock I found that first evening. I told myself I was inventorying. That's how I work when I don't trust a place yet. You note entrances, weaknesses, resources, small inconsistencies. You don't let atmosphere make your decisions for you. That approach had served me well in every unfamiliar room I'd ever had to sleep in. It just wasn't enough there. By dusk, the temperature had dropped outside, but inside the cabin, the floor still held a trace of warmth. Not everywhere. Only in a rough oval through the middle of the room, centered near the table. When I stood over it for too long, I got a little pressure in my ears, like descending a steep road too fast with the windows shut. It wasn't painful. It was just wrong, in the kind of sensation your body notices before your mind gives it permission. I stepped out onto the porch with my coffee and watched the last light catch on the trunks. The forest should have been loud. Even deep in the mountains, there's always some noise. Insects, night birds, a branch settling, tiny lives scraping around in the brush. But the woods around Hollis Klein's cabin seemed to hold their breath in stretches, as if sound passed around that patch of ground instead of through it. I could still smell rain that wasn't coming. Wet bark, moss, a mineral edge under it all. When darkness finally settled, it didn't spread evenly. It gathered in layers between the trees. My flashlight pushed through the first few yards and then seemed to lose confidence. I checked the locks, lit a lamp, and tried the keyring on the desk drawer near the bed. Nothing. Tried the small chest under the window. Nothing. When I picked up the key again, I saw a second object tucked behind a stack of old weather notes. A square wooden box banded with blackened steel, no bigger than a loaf of bread, with a keyhole that matched the ring in my hand. I didn't open it. Not because I wasn't curious, because something about the neatness of it bothered me. A locked box left in plain sight is either bait or a message. I didn't yet know which I was looking at. So I left it where it was and spent that first night listening to the cabin settle around me. The walls clicked softly as the temperature changed. The stove gave off one last thread of heat. From under the boards came that almost imagined quiver, too faint to call a sound, yet too consistent to dismiss as old wood. I slept badly. I still thought the inheritance was a cabin in the woods. I know now it was a position. The second night was when the noise made itself impossible to ignore. It started after full dark, once the last bird call had drained out of the ridge and the woods outside went damp and black. I was lying in bed with the blanket up to my chest, breathing in cold linen and wood smoke, when I felt a pressure in my jaw like I'd clenched too hard. Then came the low vibration. Not loud. That would have been easier. Loud gives you a source. Loud wants to be found. This stayed under the edge of hearing and settled into bone. It was in my teeth first, then the frame of the bed, then the glass chimney of the lamp, where the flame shivered without any draft touching it, and I sat up and waited for it to resolve into something ordinary. A truck on a far road, mining equipment carrying through the valley, water in pipes. But every practical explanation fell apart as soon as I tried to map it onto what my body was actually telling me. Machines rattle, water chatters. Wind moves from one side of a place to the other. This seemed to come from everywhere under the cabin at once, as if the entire patch of ground had started breathing through a closed mouth. I went to the window. The panes were cool under my fingertips. Outside, the yard looked flat and harmless in the moonlight. The tree line beyond it didn't. At first I thought I was imagining the shift because I wanted something visual to match the sensation, and then I fixed on one split-trunk poplar at the edge of the clearing and kept my eyes on it until they watered. The tree was leaning. Not a lot. Not in the dramatic storm-bent way timber can lean after a hard winter. This was subtler and stranger. Its trunk had the same rooted posture, but its crown angled by degrees toward the left side of the clearing, where the slope rose behind the cabin. I looked to the hemlock beside it. Same angle. Then the next. Same again. It was as if the entire stand had agreed on a direction. When I stepped onto the porch, the cold air hit the back of my throat and brought with it that same damp stone smell I'd noticed through the floorboards, stronger now, sharp enough to make my tongue taste dust. The trees stood utterly still. No breeze, no leaf movement, yet the upper branches all held the same quiet tilt. And I walked down into the yard, boots sinking into wet earth, and the hum in my teeth strengthened with each step toward the center. It didn't get louder. It got closer. That's the only way I know to describe it. The mountain didn't seem to be making noise. It seemed to be conducting it through me. Then it eased off. Not all at once. It lowered in a slow receding wave like something down below had turned its attention away. I stood there longer than I should have, listening to nothing but the blood in my ears. When I finally went back inside, the floor in the center of the room smelled distinctly of a cave after rain. I got down on one knee and ran my palm across the boards. Dry wood, warm surface, no visible seam, no leak, no source. The third night I tried an experiment. I set a glass of water on the table, another on the mantel, a third by the cellar door. When the vibration began, the water by the door trembled first, then the glass on the table, though not in ripples, in circles. Tight, controlled rings that spread from the center as if tapped from underneath in measured intervals. The one on the mantel barely moved at all. That was the first time I considered the possibility that whatever I was feeling had shape. Outside, the trees looked wrong again. Only this time, the shift wasn't just in the angle. I could have sworn two saplings near the path had changed places with a stump that had been farther down slope that morning. Not uprooted, not moved in any physical sense I could prove. The spacing was simply not what I'd remembered. The negative space between trunks had altered, in the way a face looks unfamiliar when one feature changes and you can't immediately say which one. I slept with the lamp on and woke before dawn with the smell of wet stone so strong in the room I thought the cellar door had been opened. It hadn't. That was when the first real edge of fear set in, not because I thought something was under the house, but because I couldn't tell whether the change was happening outside me or inside me. If a place can alter your sense of distance by an inch, it can alter everything built on that inch. Direction, sequence, trust. At the time, I still framed it as an environmental problem, some buried cavity, some low-frequency geological event. Something that could be measured if I found the right method. What I hadn't grasped yet was that measurement was already happening. On the fourth morning, I decided to map the immediate area properly. If the land was playing tricks on my depth perception, a repeatable trail would show me where the error lived. I packed water, chalk, ribbon, a notebook, and a compass from the mantel. The brass casing smelled faintly of oil and old metal when I opened it. The needle wavered longer than it should have before settling, but it settled, and that was enough for me then. I chose a narrow game trail starting behind the cabin, one Hollis Klein must have used often because the ground there was compacted and the undergrowth broken down to a clean line through the brush. The morning air carried wet leaf mold, fern, and the cold mineral scent that seemed to seep from the hill whenever the sun hadn't yet burned the mist off. I marked the first trees with chalk at shoulder height, tied ribbon at every fork, and counted paces between landmarks. A toppled birch with its roots upturned like fingers. 32 paces. A lichen-slick boulder split through the middle. 19 more. A narrow runnel of water crossing the trail, its trickle hidden under the hum of insects. 14. I took my time. I wrote everything down. When I came back to the cabin 2 hours later, I felt steadier than I had since arriving. The path existed. The forest, however strange, still yielded to method. After lunch, I tried the same route again. The air had warmed. Pine resin and sun on wet bark had changed the smell of the woods. But from the first 50 yards, I knew something was off. The chalk mark on the initial poplar was there, but higher than where I'd put it by at least the length of my hand. I blamed memory. And then I reached where the birch should have been and found only a low hump of moss-covered ground and a standing snag broken at the top. I checked the notebook, checked the compass, went back 20 paces, forward 20. The lichen-slick boulder appeared where the uprooted tree should have been, split exactly as I'd written, except now it sat on the opposite side of the trail. I didn't panic. That's important. I stopped, breathed through my nose, listened, and tested each assumption in order. Had I taken the wrong branch? No. My ribbon hung from a rhododendron at knee level, exactly where I'd tied it. Had I misidentified the landmark? Also no. The boulder had a vein of quartz through the left half. I remembered putting my thumb in the crack. Same stone, wrong location. The pressure in my ears thickened while I stood there. Not pain. Descent. Like the mountain had deepened under my feet by a few invisible feet. I kept going. The little runnel of water was gone. In its place, I found a strip of dry leaves with a deer track printed clean through them, as if no stream had crossed there in weeks. My second ribbon hung from a sapling that now stood 3 paces farther uphill than it had in the morning. Again, not torn loose, not dragged. The forest simply presented the route with different spacing, as though I had walked into a revised draft. That was the first time I wondered whether the trail itself had any stable existence independent of being used. I turned back before sunset and chose a wider route skirting the clearing. Same result. Not dramatic enough to call supernatural if I'd been telling it to somebody else. In just enough displacement to make any repeated movement uncertain. Stumps where trunks had been. A fallen limb missing. A rock face closer. A bend arriving too soon. By the third attempt, I understood the pattern. The moment I tried to force the land to repeat itself, it refused. I stood at the edge of the yard with sweat drying cold on my neck and stared into the trees until the light faded green. My notebook smelled of damp paper and graphite. The chalk on my fingers had turned to paste. Somewhere deeper on the slope, a woodpecker knocked 3 hard strikes into a trunk, then stopped so abruptly the silence felt staged. That evening I walked the perimeter of the clearing without leaving it and noticed something I'd missed before. The trees nearest the cabin all leaned very slightly toward the lower ground during the day. By dusk, and the tilt had changed, not dramatic, a shared degree or two. Now they angled toward the uphill side where the ridge rose behind the house. If I moved into the center of the yard, the pressure in my ears sharpened. When I stepped uphill, it eased. I wish I could say I understood the meaning right then. I didn't. I only knew the mountain was consistent about one thing. It did not want my steps to fall the same way twice. Looking back, that was the last stage where I believed the place was reacting to me. The truth was worse. It had started arranging me. Mary Beth Colleen Rusk came to the cabin on the 5th afternoon without making enough noise for me to hear her approach. I was splitting kindling behind the house, the air full of fresh-cut sap and the clean crack of wood when a voice behind me said, "Ed Hollis Klein never let it take a second look." I turned too fast and nearly clipped her with the hatchet. She stood just beyond the chopping block in a faded green raincoat that smelled faintly of smoke and wet wool, though the day was dry. She was older than me by at least a couple of decades, maybe more. Mountain years are hard to count from a face. Her hair was pinned back carelessly, and her eyes had that fixed, unworried look some people get when they've mistaken familiarity for safety. "I didn't hear you come up," I said. "Most don't at first." She glanced past me at the cabin windows. "You're Eamon Dillard Pike." I didn't like hearing my full name from a stranger in that clearing. "And you are?" "Mary Beth Colleen Rusk." She offered no hand. I was neighbor enough to Hollis Klein. Neighbor up there. He turned out to mean a person who lived somewhere beyond the next ridge and considered the intervening forest a kind of hallway. We talked on the porch because she wouldn't come inside, or maybe because she didn't want me observing what she observed from the yard. The boards under us carried that faint noon warmth again, and every few minutes I'd feel the tiniest vibration under my boots. Mary Beth Rusk seemed to notice each one the way another person might notice a clock ticking. "You planning to stay?" she asked. "For a while." She nodded like I'd confirmed a suspicion she already disliked. Hollis Klein stayed because he knew how to. I asked her what that meant. She looked into the trees instead of at me. Means he didn't argue with the place. It means he understood that these mountains correct themselves. The word was so specific I heard it twice in my head. Correct. I laughed a little then, not because I found it funny, but because sometimes practicality needs air before it speaks. Correct what? Anything that starts reading wrong. That was the first conversation where every answer made the previous question smaller. I asked if there was mining under the property. Old shafts, gas pockets, something that might explain the vibration at night. Mary Beth Rusk listened politely, almost kindly, the way you'd listen to a person describing weather patterns on the surface of a lake while something larger moved underneath. "Did it notice you yet?" she asked. The woods were still. Somewhere behind the cabin, water dripped from a branch, though there'd been no rain. I don't know what that means," I said. Her gaze moved to my boots, then to the chalk stains still faint on my fingers. "You've been trying to walk a path back into itself." I didn't answer. Hollis Klein knew better. Then he could have left instructions. He did. She said it so simply that for a second I thought she meant the locked box and knew about it somehow. Before I could ask, she added, "Only men like Hollis Klein never trusted a warning spoken once. They liked things written down." I felt the temperature drop by a degree, nothing dramatic, just enough that the inside of my nose caught the colder air. "What exactly was his role here?" I asked. Mary Beth Rusk smiled, and it wasn't a comforting expression. "Same as yours now. Keep from making it work harder than it has to." I asked what it was. She shook her head. No point naming something that doesn't need a name from us." That sort of talk would have sent me inside with an excuse under normal circumstances. Not because it scared me, but because obscurity used like wisdom usually means a person enjoys feeling essential. But there was nothing performative in her tone. No showmanship, no desire to impress. Mary Beth Rusk sounded like somebody reciting workplace procedure for machinery she'd been trained not to touch. She stood to leave without another word, then paused at the edge of the porch and laid one hand flat on the rail. Her palm stayed there a second too long, as if feeling through the wood. "If the trees lean," she said quietly, "don't stand there thinking about it." Then she walked into the timber and vanished in about 10 steps, swallowed by shade and rhododendron, and the kind of terrain that turns people into memory faster than distance should allow. I stayed on the porch until dusk, replaying every line she'd given me. The air thickened with the scent of fern and wet bark. Midges gathered in the colder pockets under the eaves. When the first vibration of evening came through the cabin frame, I noticed something I hadn't before. Mary Beth Rusk hadn't asked whether I'd heard the sound. She hadn't asked whether I'd seen anything unusual. She'd asked whether it had noticed me. That told me two things. First, whatever Hollis Klein had understood was not unique to him. Second, people around that mountain didn't think the phenomenon was passive. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat at the table with the lamp turned low, the flame smelling faintly of singed dust, and then stared at the locked box until the room blurred around it. At some point after midnight, the hum under the floor rose high enough that I could match it against my breathing. Inhale, exhale, pulse, pulse, closer, closer. I remembered Mary Beth Rusk saying Hollis Klein had written things down, and all at once the idea of leaving that box unopened felt less cautious and more stupid. The key turned with a dry little scrape. The lock clicked. Old paper and cedar came up from inside. There were 5 folded sheets in Hollis Klein's hand. No greeting, no explanation, just rules. I spread them out under the lamp, the light yellow on the page, and read the first line aloud without meaning to. If the ground hum rises above your breathing, leave the cabin immediately. My mouth went dry because I had already ignored that one, and the second sheet said, do not walk the same path twice in one day. I stopped there and looked toward the dark window where my own reflection floated pale over the black yard. The third read, if the trees lean, you are standing where they are measuring, move uphill. The fourth, never sleep through the silence. If the sound stops, something has changed. The fifth, if you hear knocking from below, do not answer it in any way. I read them all twice more. Hollis Klein's handwriting was square and controlled, the script of a man who had copied the same instructions often enough that they no longer looked like language to him, just required marks. There were smudges at the edges where fingers had handled the pages over many years. On the back of the last sheet, in smaller writing, he had added only one line. Delay is not safety. No signature, no context. Nothing about what the sound was, what did the measuring, or why the cabin needed rules instead of repairs. But the rules did something more useful than explanation. They snapped my previous week into a pattern. The rising hum at night wasn't incidental. It marked a threshold. The shifting trails weren't my confusion. They were a response to repeated movement. The leaning trees weren't damage or wind bias. They indicated a location where something in the land was taking measure. And the silence. I hadn't yet experienced a full stop in the vibration, not consciously. But the rule made it clear that if I ever woke to complete stillness, whatever process had been running beneath the cabin would be in a new state, and that new state would matter immediately. I spent the rest of that night changing how I moved, and when the vibration rose, I stepped outside and waded uphill from the clearing until it lowered again. When I crossed the woods the next day, I never used the same approach twice, cutting diagonals, circling stones, stepping over logs I would have ducked under on a previous pass. It felt absurd at first, ritualized, superstitious. Then I noticed the disorientation ease. Not disappear, but ease. Landmarks still felt unstable. They no longer felt hostile. That difference was everything. I began keeping notes of sensations instead of just visible changes. When the smell of damp stone thickened, the pressure in my ears followed within minutes. When the trees took that common lean, the center of the yard became unpleasant to stand in. When I stayed uphill during those episodes, the feeling faded faster. The rules worked, and that's what made them terrifying. Because once a rule works in a place you don't understand, you've already accepted a fact larger than the rule itself. You've accepted that somebody learned it by surviving long enough to write it down, and that the thing it warns against has repeated enough times to become procedure. Hollis Klein hadn't left me folklore. He'd left me field notes. I still didn't know whether he had been watching the mountain or hiding from it. But my model of the place changed that night in one important way. The cabin was no longer just where strange things happened. It was where somebody had spent years learning when the mountain noticed a living thing above it. The silence came on the 9th night, not gradually, not as a fading. I woke because the hum was gone, and the absence of it struck me harder than any sound had. For several seconds, I didn't know what had dragged me out of sleep. Then my body caught up. My ears felt packed tight the way they do during a fast descent, and the room around me seemed to have enlarged by a fraction, as if the walls had stepped back. The lamp had burned out. The cabin smelled of cold ash, old pine boards, and that subterranean mineral scent so strong it almost had a taste. I didn't waste time making sense of it. Hollis Klein's 4th rule was too clear for that. Never sleep through the silence. If the sound stops, something has changed. I was already awake. That meant I still had whatever margin the rule assumed. I pulled on my boots without socks, took the lamp, then put it back because I didn't trust open flame if I had to move fast. Flashlight, coat, keys, and the floor under my feet was warm enough to make my skin crawl. Not hot, warm in the way a forehead is warm when somebody's running a fever. When I reached the main room, I stopped. The silence outside wasn't natural either. No insects. No leaves ticking against one another, no night bird, no far-off water. The mountain had gone into a stillness so complete I could hear the dry fabric of my sleeve brush my wrist when I reached for the door. I opened it and stepped into black air. The cold struck first, clean and wet. Then the pressure in my ears worsened until my jaw ached. The yard looked wrong at once, though it took me a second to understand why. Every tree around the clearing was leaning inward. Not toward the uphill slope now, not toward one side of the property. Toward the cabin. The trunks kept their roots, and the crowns had angled as one, converging subtly on the structure like iron filings arranging around a magnet. Under the flashlight beam, their bark looked slick, almost sweating. I could smell stone, wet bark, and something older beneath both. An underground odor like water sealed away so long it had forgotten light. I moved uphill. That wasn't courage. It was obedience. Hollis Klein's rules had reduced the number of choices I had to make, and I followed them because men who improvise around unknown systems usually become examples. Halfway up the slope, the pressure eased a little. I turned and looked back. The cabin sat black and square in the clearing. No movement. No light. But the geometry of the scene had changed. The yard no longer looked like open ground around a house. It looked like a marked point. Every tree was oriented to it. Every shadow seemed to radiate from it. I had the overwhelming sense that if I could see below the soil, there would be lines there too, converging. Then the knock came. One strike. Deliberate. From under the cabin floor, loud enough to carry through the still air and up the hill to where I stood. Not a settling board. Not a root shifting in wet ground. Knuckles. That was what my body called it before my mind could interfere. A single knock, placed with intent. I clenched my teeth so hard my jaw hurt. Rule 5. If you hear knocking from below, do not answer it in any way. No speaking, no pounding back. No movement that could be mistaken for response. I don't know how I understood the rule that broadly, but I did. I stood frozen among cold ferns and slick leaves, the flashlight shaking faintly in my hand. Ian refused every instinct that told me to run, shout, or even breathe too loud. Nothing followed. That was worse, because an unanswered knock implies patience. I stayed on the slope until dawn bled a weak gray into the gaps between trees. The stillness lasted maybe an hour, maybe 3. Time behaved badly under that kind of pressure. When sound finally returned, it came back in layers. First a distant drip, then a single insect, then the slight breath of air through needles high overhead. Only after that did the hum beneath the ground begin again, low and steady, as if some buried machine had resumed after a planned interruption. I went back down only when the trees had relaxed from their inward tilt. Inside the cabin, nothing appeared disturbed. Table where I'd left it, chair straight, bed untouched, but the center of the floor held a stronger warmth than ever before. And when I crouched there, I could feel a patterned vibration, not random pulses but grouped sequences. 3 close together, pause, 2, longer pause, 4, not language, not anything so convenient. Pattern. I spent that day thinking in reverse. If the silence represented change, then the ongoing hum represented process. If the knocks came during the silence, then whatever existed below waited until the process paused to make contact. And if the trees leaned inward toward the cabin during that pause, the structure itself wasn't incidental shelter. It was the surface point around which the change was taking shape. At the time, I assumed the cabin attracted the effect because it was built over something unusual. And I know now the cabin had been built there because the mountain already had use for that point. By then I had stopped pretending I would leave after a week and be done with it. Not because I felt attached to the place, because once you know a rule set exists, you either abandon it immediately or learn enough to know what abandoning it means. I wasn't ready to drive off with 5 sentences and a knock under the floor as my only understanding. So I went looking below. The obvious entrance was the cellar door, the one with the newer iron latch. Until then I'd treated it as storage, something Hollis Klein had reinforced against weather or animals. When I opened it after the silence event, a breath of air rose up carrying cold mineral damp and the smell of soaked limestone. The steps were narrow, steep, and slick with a sheen that wasn't water exactly, more like persistent condensation. My flashlight beam caught old wood braces, stacked jars, empty shelves, and the rough wall of the cut earth cellar. At first glance, it was ordinary. Then I shut off my light and felt the vibration. Down there it was unmistakable, not heard, felt. It moved through the soles of my boots and the bones of my ankles in layered waves, as if the ground beneath the packed dirt floor contained hollow spaces carrying a current from somewhere far below. When I turned the flashlight back on and swept it low, I noticed a section at the rear wall where the earth had slumped away from exposed stone. The stone wasn't natural wall. It was a seam. I knelt and scraped back the loose dirt with a shovel, the smell of wet clay filling the cellar around me. And under the top layer lay a slab fitted over a deeper opening. Not masonry, not proper construction. Just a flat piece of local rock deliberately set to cover a void. Hollis Klein had braced shelves in front of it, not to hide it well. To hide it from anyone who didn't already suspect there was something under the cellar worth hiding. The slab took all my leverage to shift. Cold air rose from the gap beneath it, carrying that old cave breath with a thread of metal in it, like water that had run across iron for a very long time. I widened the opening enough to lie flat and shine the light down. The beam dropped into a narrow hollow, maybe 6 feet deep at the first plunge, then sloped out of sight under the cabin. Not a mine shaft, no tool marks, no blasted edges. The stone had been worn into smooth channels by age and seepage, curving and branching the way bone hollows branch when you look at them on a scan. Along the walls, thin films of moisture caught the light and flashed dully. Every few seconds, the channel itself seemed to shiver. I held the flashlight against the rock and pressed my palm to the dirt. The pulses came back through the ground in grouped sequences. Not quite evenly spaced, not random either. A cluster. Pause. Another cluster. Longer interval. Then a change in strength that traveled from one branch to another as if something far away had answered and the reply was arriving through different depths at slightly different times. That was when the scale of my assumptions first broke. Because a local cavity under one cabin doesn't answer from multiple directions. I spent hours down there over the next 2 days, never entering the hollow itself. He's only listening at different points, laying my ear against rock, setting bits of loose gravel on the exposed stone and watching them tremble. Once I scattered dry dirt across the slab and saw fine lines form in it with each pulse, branching from separate vectors the way interference patterns form in water. Another time I drove a metal rod into the cellar floor near the seam and felt the vibration strengthen the deeper it went, as if the soil became more conductive with depth. The land was transmitting something, not heat, not gas, not random seismic energy. Patterned signals through a buried network of hollows that extended beneath and beyond the cabin. The low hum I'd heard at night was only the surface expression of a larger exchange happening under enough earth that only a fraction reached the boards above. Once that thought settled, the other observations rearranged themselves around it. The trees leaning in common orientation, the trails refusing repetition, the pressure in my ears at specific points in the yard. Those weren't separate phenomena, they were surface effects. Indicators that the network below was not only present but reading conditions above it and adjusting accordingly. I didn't yet know what counted as a condition. I only knew the mountain was not dormant ground with one strange cavity inside it. It was a system, ancient enough that the channels looked grown rather than cut, extensive enough that signals reached the cabin from more than one direction, and active enough that Hollis Klein had lived over a node of it with a rule set designed to keep attention off himself. The cabin wasn't a house placed over mystery, and it was a monitoring point placed where the mystery touched the surface. Mary Beth Colleen Rusk came back the day after I uncovered the hollow, and by then I had stopped seeing her as a neighbor in any ordinary sense. She arrived near sunset while the air smelled of cooling bark and distant rain. Though the sky remained clear and she found me standing uphill from the cabin watching the tree line for changes in tilt. "You opened it," she said. There was no point denying that. She followed my gaze toward the clearing. "Hollis Klein told me you'd either leave early or go underneath. Thoughtful men always choose underneath." "What is it?" I asked. Mary Beth Rusk gave a small shrug. "Balance. That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters." I could feel the hum in my molars even with daylight still hanging in the trees. And that had started happening more often, the vibration arriving before dark as if the boundary between active and inactive hours had shifted since I'd come. Or maybe I'd only grown good enough at noticing it to stop missing the early stages. "The channels go farther than this property," I said. "A lot farther." Mary Beth Rusk seemed almost pleased. "You finally heard the reach of it." "Heard enough to know Hollis Klein wasn't maintaining a cabin. He was interrupting something." At that, her expression changed. Not anger, disappointment. "He was delaying correction. That's not the same thing." The word again, correction. It had weight to her, reverence even. I asked what needed correcting. Too many deer, too many people, something in the soil. She listened, patient as ever, and then said the line that still wakes me on some nights. "You do anything that stays where it tips the count." I remember the smell in that moment. Wet fern, stone, my own sweat cooling under the collar. The sentence didn't sound mystical. It sounded administrative, like I had stumbled onto the language of a process old enough to have no room for malice or mercy. Count of what? Living weight, habit, direction, nesting, return. She looked past me to the slope where the trunks were beginning their evening shift. "You think in categories too small for it." I almost told her to stop talking like a riddle and start speaking plainly, but she was speaking plainly, at least as plainly as she knew how. The trouble was that the thing she believed in had no reason to fit human categories cleanly, and her faith in it had made peace with that long before I arrived. She started walking not toward the porch, but toward a narrow opening in the woods to the east side of the clearing. I followed because I couldn't think of a better way to learn where her certainty ended. The ground there was soft with decades of needles, the air cooler and rich with mushroom rot and damp bark. We moved without talking until the trees thinned around a natural hollow where the canopy opened just enough to let gray light pool on the ground. Mary Beth Rusk stepped into the middle of it and stopped. I smelled stone before I felt the pressure. Then both hit at once. My ears tightened. The low vibration climbed through the soles of my boots in layered waves. The trees around the hollow began to lean, not swaying, not wind-pulled. They tilted by degrees altogether, branches angling inward with a slow, collective intent that made my scalp tighten. And Mary Beth Rusk didn't move. Her hands rested at her sides. Her face had gone soft, almost relieved. "Mary Beth," I said, and my voice sounded muffled inside my own head. She whispered something I couldn't fully hear, not because of distance, because the hum under the ground thickened around the words and swallowed parts of them. I caught only fragments. "Still here. Then, I know." Then, after a pause that felt too deliberate to belong to any human conversation, "He couldn't keep doing it." The trees leaned farther. Every survival instinct I had told me to move uphill, drag her if I could, get out of the measuring point. Hollis Klein's third rule didn't leave room for interpretation. If the trees lean, you are standing where they are measuring. Move uphill. I went in 2 steps and grabbed her arm, and her skin was cold through the raincoat sleeve, not outdoor cold. Stone cold. She turned to me with total calm, and that calm was the most frightening thing about her. "You don't stop weather by pulling on it," she said. "This isn't weather." "No." She gave a tiny nod toward the ground under us. "It's older." Then the hum changed. The sequence underfoot shifted from rolling pulses into a tighter clustered pattern, fast enough that the dirt at our boots trembled. Mary Beth Rusk looked down like someone hearing her name from another room. I let go and moved uphill. I hate that part of the story. I understand it, but I hate it. I had already learned enough to know one person's refusal could kill 2 people without teaching either anything useful. So I backed away uphill, eyes on her, lungs full of cold leaf-scented air, even while the trees continued their slow, inward angle. She never screamed, never called for help. The last clear image I have of Mary Beth Colleen Rusk is her standing motionless in that hollow with her head slightly inclined, whispering to something below the earth as if answering a question asked in a language carried through stone. When I came back at first light, the hollow was empty. No drag marks, no broken brush, no body, no obvious sign of departure. Only the ground in the center had hardened into a smooth oval patch where the leaf litter lay pressed flat and the surrounding saplings still held a residual tilt toward that one place. That was when Trigger 2, the wrongness I'd been cataloging in pieces, gave way to Trigger 1, scale. Because Mary Beth Rusk's words, the missing paths, the changing orientation of trees, and the silence events, the patterned signals under the cabin, all of it suddenly connected to something larger than one inherited property. McDowell County had towns that thinned out for reasons people called economic, practical, inevitable. Valleys where game shifted routes and never quite settled. Old roads that went underused for no reason that looked dramatic on paper. Hollis Klein had not been managing a private haunting. He had been standing at one point in a regional mechanism. And Mary Beth Rusk had given herself to it so completely that she no longer saw human departure from a place as loss. Just balance returning. By then, there wasn't any version of my life where I went back to treating the mountain like scenery. The final understanding came because I stopped asking what the system was and started asking what, exactly, it did with the information it gathered. I spent one more full cycle at the cabin after Mary Beth Rusk vanished, long enough to compare the signals under the cellar with the shifts above ground, long enough to confirm that repeated presence changed the sequences. long enough to understand why Hollis Klein's rules were framed the way they were. The hum rose when I stayed too long in one place. It intensified when I repeated routes. The trees leaned when I occupied certain surface points where the pressure in my ears grew strongest. And moving uphill reduced the effect because elevation changed my relationship to whatever line or node the system was using at that moment. The silence events were not failures, they were transitions. Periods when the ongoing exchange beneath the mountain paused, recalculated, and resumed in a new pattern. And in the knocks, I only heard them twice more, once just after a silence event. Once at noon after spending too much time over the exposed hollow in the cellar. Both single knocks, both directly beneath the cabin, never followed by force, never followed by voice. Contact wasn't the point, acknowledgement was. That distinction nearly broke me, because if the mountain had wanted something simple like bodies near certain places or predictable avoidance of others, the rules would have read differently. Don't go there. Don't open this. Don't stay after dark. Ordinary danger has boundaries. Hollis Klein's rules managed something subtler. They regulated pattern, breathing against the hum. Route repetition, sleeping through transitions, standing in the wrong measuring point, answering a knock, and he had not been trying to survive a creature in the woods. He had been trying to delay a system from resolving him as an anomaly. That is the sentence I would carve into the side of the cabin if I ever went back, and I won't. Once I understood that, the earlier pieces turned over and showed their real faces. The missing paths weren't traps. The mountain wasn't getting lost. It was preventing stable return vectors from forming around an active human presence. The leaning trees were not warning signs in the way we mean warning. They were instrumentation. Surface orientation responding to the buried signal network as it measured distribution, density, persistence. And the cabin itself, with its heavy walls, warm floor, reinforced cellar access, and central patch of strongest vibration, had never been a refuge. It was a node, in a monitoring station built by people who had recognized one of the points where the underground system came nearest the surface, and learned, through trial and loss, that a disciplined occupant could muddy the readings. Delay correction, not stop it. Delay it. That explained Hollis Klein better than anything else ever could. He hadn't been caretaker in the sentimental mountain sense. He had been a professional witness to an ancient mechanism, keeping routine, controlling his own patterns, writing rules not because he expected victory, but because maintenance of uncertainty was the only service a man could provide at a node like that. Live lightly. Vary movement. Don't answer. Don't let the process settle around you cleanly enough to finish its work. And I had ruined that the moment I arrived, not by malice, by existence, a new body, new habits, new breathing, new routes, new sleep cycle. The system below the mountain had spent my first week sampling, comparing, adjusting. The reason the disturbances escalated wasn't that I had awakened something dormant. It was that something continuous had begun incorporating me into its calculations. Loop 3, the question I couldn't escape, formed completely then. Was I meant to observe the system, or had I already become part of its function simply by living above it long enough? The answer, I think, is both. Hollis Klein had observed because observation altered behavior, and altered behavior delayed recognition. But any living thing at a node becomes a data source whether it wishes to or not. Presence is participation. That's the rule hidden beneath all the others. The maximum revelation didn't happen as a flash, and it settled over several hours while the air turned cold and metallic before another silence event. I sat at Hollis Klein's table with the pages spread in front of me, fingertips on wood that trembled faintly under the next rising sequence, and cataloged everything I knew as precisely as I could, because precision was the only shape my mind had left for fear. There was a buried geological network under that stretch of Appalachia, ancient beyond settlement and probably beyond history we would call local. It consisted of hollow channels through stone and soil that carried low-frequency patterned signals across distance. Those signals influenced orientation above ground not by magic but by persistent interaction with living systems. Trees leaned, animal roots shifted. A human perception of space and sequence became unreliable in ways that reduced repeated occupation. The system did not merely respond to life, it regulated distribution of life by making certain forms of staying, nesting, and returning less stable. In places where the network approached the surface strongly enough, people built monitoring points. The cabin was one of them, maybe one among many. Hollis Klein's role had been to inhabit that node in disciplined, irregular ways that prevented the system from arriving at an efficient correction around a stable human presence. Mary Beth Rusk, by contrast, believed correction was proper, desirable. She had accepted the mountain's logic so fully that she no longer distinguished between protection and removal. And the system was larger than the property, larger than that ridge. Large enough that regional absence, migration anomalies, settlement thinning, and the persistent wrongness of certain stretches of mountain might all be surface expressions of the same buried regulation. I understood finally why delay is not safety had been written on the back of the last page. Because delay was the only thing a person at a node could buy, not escape, not mastery, time. The hum rose higher, higher than my breathing. Rule 1. I stood at once, no hesitation now. The air in the cabin had changed. The damp stone smell was so thick it made the room seem subterranean already, like the house had begun admitting the layer below it into the walls. My ears tightened. The glasses on the table rang faintly against the wood. Outside, through the window, I could see the trees beginning their collective angle toward the clearing. I took the pages. I took the keys. I left everything else. At the porch, I stopped only long enough to look back through the doorway at the table, the bolted chairs, the square darkness of the cellar entrance. The knock came then from beneath the center of the room. Single, deliberate, not angry, not urgent, expectant. I shut the door without answering and moved uphill. The forest was cold and wet against my face, leaves brushing my sleeves, the scent of soil and bark almost painfully vivid. Behind me, the cabin disappeared faster than it should have among the trunks. Not because the distance was great, but because places like that don't stay visually available once you've chosen to leave them during an active reading. I didn't look back again. I varied my route by instinct and by Hollis Klein's rules, never cutting the same contour twice. Always climbing when the pressure in my ears increased. Always pausing when the trees around me began to settle into a common orientation. It took until dawn to reach my truck, though in ordinary terrain it should have taken a fraction of that. When I finally got to the road, the first ordinary sound I heard was a crow. I nearly cried from relief at how rude and unstructured it sounded. I drove out of McDowell County without stopping. Gravel, mud, ruts, wider road, gas station, interstate. The whole sequence felt unreal, too flat and human and brightly packaged after what I'd left behind. I kept waiting for the pressure in my ears to return full force. It didn't. Not then. By the time I crossed far enough west that the ridges changed shape and the air lost that stone-deep wetness, the hum in my teeth had faded completely. I never went back, and that part is clean. The main action ended there. I left the cabin, I left the mountains, I settled far enough away that no floor under me has ever warmed from below in that same intimate way again. No trees outside my windows move in shared alignment without weather to justify it. No night sound near my current home carries that deep, patterned undertone of buried channels speaking through earth. And I can't go back. Not because of courage, because understanding has a cost the body remembers better than the mind does. There are places you can survive and still lose the ability to inhabit any version of yourself that existed before them. The man who arrived at Hollis Klein's cabin believed land was passive until acted upon. Believed habit belonged to the person, not the place. Believed being noticed required eyes. I don't believe any of that now. Sometimes, usually in the dead center of the night when appliances have gone still and traffic has thinned enough for the world to flatten into one big held breath, a total silence will settle over my house for a second too long. When that happens, the pressure returns to my ears, very slight. Just enough to remind me of altitude with no movement, no hum, no warm floor. Just that inward tightening. I've moved miles away. More than miles. Different state lines, different soil, different kinds of trees, but every once in a while I wake from sleep because the absence of sound feels active, and for 1 second I don't know whether that's memory or reach. I still have Hollis Klein's rules. The pages smell less like cedar now and more like the drawer I keep them in, but on damp nights the old mineral odor comes back faintly from the paper as if the mountain left its own residue in the fibers. I haven't shown them to anyone. I wouldn't know how to start without sounding insane or worse, accurate. As for Mary Beth Colleen Rusk, I checked public records once from a library terminal 2 towns over from where I live now. Her property taxes went unpaid for a while, then stopped appearing at all in the county system. That can mean plenty of ordinary things in a place like that. Paperwork gaps, transfers, error. I tell myself that because the alternative is a woman standing in a measuring hollow until the mountain finished deciding what category she belonged in. I've developed one habit I can't explain to other people. Whenever a room goes completely silent, and I stop breathing for a second and wait to see if the pressure in my ears rises above it. And if I'm outside, I check the trees before I check the door.